Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Hi, I'm Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote, named for Adam Smith, brought to you by Liberty Fund. To learn more, visit www.AdamSmithWorks.org. Welcome back. Today, on May 17th, 2023, we're going to be doing something a little different on the podcast, taking a little detour from classical liberalism and straight economics to political psychology. I'm excited to welcome George Mason University professor Dan Klein to the podcast. He's been here to talk about Adam Smith's 3 types of justice, and today we're going to be talking about the band man and how we're not in the band anymore. This relates to Hayek and some of the stuff that he talks about, which we're going to be getting into. This is not about rock and roll bands. This is about a different type of band. So welcome, Dan.
Thanks very much, Juliet.
So before we get started, as always, what is one of the most important things that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
Okay. I'm not sure you should know this. It's a conjecture on my part. Consider it. And it's that it is good to look upward. And I mean that literally, as in having your head pointed upward. So if you spend a lot of time looking at a computer screen, that means making sure that you look at a screen that's mounted in such a way that the base of the screen is above your eye level, so that as you look at the screen, your head is tilted upward. I think perhaps of particular importance is that it's this way while you write. So look upward while you write. I suggest that like an upward tilt of the head and eyes actually conduces to writing that is oriented upward in a kind of ethical sense. That's my suggestion.
So I guess does looking forward count, or does it have to be like up?
Up. It's up and down. Virtue is up and vice is down. And you want to be looking up, like you feel like there's something larger than you, and up. And it's actually like a gestural thing.
And what is the importance of bringing this into the physical realm, I guess?
I think that your posture and such like evokes it in you or arouses it. It puts you in a certain frame of mind. I mean, it's a conjecture. I could be crazy, but there it is.
I don't think you're crazy. I don't know entirely why, but in this sense, I'm kind of on board with this.
Okay.
So
try it.
Let's get into this. Mm-hmm. You want to title this episode? Well, we've agreed to title this episode "We're Not in the Band Anymore." What does that mean? Who's the band?
The we here is us today, as though you and I and the listeners extend a being that spans our prehistoric ancestors. So we're like making the species Homo sapiens the we, as we might talk about human nature as we. So we, in this sense, used to live in small bands, the hunter-gatherer band. It isn't long ago, really, that we left the band, only like 12,000 years ago. And understand before that, just to review, our species evolved from other mammal species over, say, 200 million years. Our deep roots as pack animals or troops of apes goes back tens of millions of years. Homo sapiens first appeared 200,000 or 300,000 years ago and lived in small, simple bands. About 80,000 years ago, some of our ancestors left Africa. As for the development of language, realized that throughout this kind of crucible, if you like, of our genes, we're talking about language that was only very primitive at best. So About 12,000 years ago, agriculture begins. And it's principally with agriculture that human existence shifts from something like small bands and then tribes to settlement and larger settled formations. And so the science tells us, that our genes have not changed that much. So, you might wonder, are babies born today that much different than babies born in 10,000 BC? And if not, that means that we are still basically band man at birth, and that we're working with that genetic makeup that evolved for life in small, simple bands of, say, 40 people. And as I say, the answer seems to be that babies born today are pretty much the same as in 10,000 BC. I know we're more lactose tolerant. I believe that we're smarter somewhat in an IQ sense. But basically, if you had a time machine and could swap babies between today and then, nobody would really know the difference. So the upshot is we're still band man. But clearly, we're not in the band anymore. We're born with genetics, adopted to that environment. And it's been continually tweaked, as it were, down to 10,000 BC. And that genetic makeup creates a kind of genetic memory that's in us, okay? So we have instincts, bents, penchants, yearnings, mentalities that are all vestiges of band life, but we're not in the band anymore. Our social world is wildly different from our ancestors of 10,000 BC. Should I go on?
So I guess what is the significance of this? What does it mean for current day that we are band man, but we don't live in band world?
It means that these penchants and pents and instincts can lead us into ways of thinking and desires and practices and even cultures that haven't caught up with, the modern world, with the modern conditions. Let me give you an analogy, and that is our penchant for sweets. We have a penchant for sweets because that penchant induced people way back when to eat up sweets while the eating was good and store energy on their bodies as fat. And so they survived and passed that penchant on. It was adopted by the environment, if you will, that penchant. Today, however, sweets are not scarce. And if you indulge that penchant, you gain too much weight. Now, we have personally quite strong incentives to subdue the penchant for sweets. And so we learn to control it to some extent or another. Not all of us are satisfied with how much we learn to control it. But, we do learn to control it to a good degree because it's no longer suited to our modern conditions. Now, I believe that we're beset with that kind of problem. And Hayek taught us this. His interpretation of modern collectivist politics is that this new politics, which takes the nation as a band, has tapped into these band man bents and mentalities and appeals to them and panders to them, really. It arouses collectivist politics, these bents and mentalities, and all of this spells bigger government. I like to speak, by the way, of the governmentalization of social affairs, and I think governmentalization is bad. So if our band man bents and mentalities spell this governmentalization, that is a tragedy today. Hayek, for this, used the term atavism, meaning an unfortunate throwback to something, here a bent or mentality, that no longer suits the current situation. And so we need to see that we're not in the band anymore and act accordingly is the idea.
Can you quickly clarify and kind of solidify this transition from the band man in relation to sweets and sugar to using government as a method.
Well, there's a whole lot of, I would say, even spiritual, epistemic things that are kind of in our genes from being band man, that we yearn for certain things, certain ways of understanding things, certain ways of belonging, of validation, of conformity, and so forth. And I think these various features, almost existential features of Homo sapiens, makes collectivist politics appealing in their ideas and slogans and simplifications of the world, and their promise of sort of us taking care of us, which was a very bandish, way of life. That's the way bands survived and persisted. There's a bunch of dimensions and angles to this. Before I can go into that, but I'd like to also refer to a saying of Hannah Arendt. It's along the lines of the Hayek. She said, and perhaps you've heard this saying before, that with each generation we face invasion by barbarians. We call them our children. Our children are born band man, and unless they become civilized, they will become full-grown barbarians. And so it's only by properly acculturating them to the modern world, which is, again, so vastly different from our sort of like our genetic programming, that they can become, more suited to the modern world, avoid the biases and pitfalls of their bandman bents and mentalities. I think, let me also add that this saying by Hannah Arendt should make us realize that for collectivism to succeed, it doesn't really depend in a way on theorizing or philosophizing. It's not like you need a doctrine or philosophy or belief system of collectivism. All that collectivism needs to thrive is the destruction of that civilizing process, of the whole cultural inheritance that made us modern people and modern culture, including traditions of philosophy and religion, which have developed to check and subdue bandman Benson mentalities. If collectivism can destroy those civilizing philosophies and religion, it wins. And I'd say we all lose. So this is a very profound way of looking at things. It's saying that the collectivist philosophies or movements or, politics are not so much about some particular intellectual doctrine. It's more just about destroying, pushing off, somehow subverting the civilizing traditions. Because once you clear the field of that, and once they clear the field of that, people are left being born barbarians and, going back to bandman, and I think going for collectivist politics in that fashion.
This whole thing is kind of interesting because it seems if you look at the way that government functions and the basic structure of a human life in the eyes of government, when you turn 18, you're no longer a barbarian. You're an adult. You're civilized. And obviously we know that that's not necessarily the case because different people become, quote unquote, civilized at different points. But this also kind of falls in line with the more libertarian way of thinking that's saying that people always say where this regulation is basically just turning adults and treating adults like babies and like children. So I just find it interesting to point that out. So if we're born with these bandman Benson mentalities, what is the big problem with that? So we're not in the band anymore. That's pretty obvious. Our world is so big. especially with social media and all. Like, the world is evidently huge. But why does it matter that the things around us have changed so much while we haven't?
See, today, if people are seeing like a band man and try to do things along the lines of bandman Benson mentalities, I say, and Hayek said, and others, it's not just Hayek, the result is in politics and government is governmentalization and even tyranny. Hayek, spoke of the road to serfdom. I would say that in discourse and thinking and learning and education, the result is false philosophies, although sometimes those are no more than sort of tirades and slogans, really, in my view. They're not very serious or substantive very often. And in personal life, if someone is, yearning for bandman things, which they just can't have, essentially, it can be a personal rejection of reality, resulting in denial, self-delusion, self-deceit, hypocrisy, and I would say often miserableness, which is often medicalized as mental illnesses and disorders. So I think the stakes are just super huge here. Like, we need to face the reality that we're not in the band anymore, and this puts huge responsibility on us to kind of update, as it were, to adjust, to modify, redirect so much of our instinctual tendencies. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I see it. I guess, like, what sort of an outlook should we have? If we're not going to have the bandman mentality, then what sort of outlook, what sort of behavior should we have? Yeah,
that's a great question, and there's a number of conceptual points I'd like to raise, and I can give some illustrations of it too. Let me just say, Juliet, let me just make a point before I lose track of it, and I want to emphasize that we're talking about the band. And that is not the same thing as the tribe. The tribe is actually later and bigger and has a bit more social hierarchy to it. And this is not just, Hayek said so. I can quote here the Encyclopedia Britannica, which quotes certain anthropologists saying a band was a small, egalitarian, kin-based group of perhaps 10 to 50 people, while a tribe comprised a number of bands that were politically integrated, often through a council of elders or other leaders, and shared a language, religious beliefs, and other aspects of culture. Similarly, if you look on Wikipedia on the page just for tribe, you'll see bulleted like stages. And one bullet is hunter-gatherer bands that are generally egalitarian. The next bullet is tribal societies with some limited instances of social rank and prestige. And then it goes on to stratified tribal societies. And then later, the agriculture and the real settlement. And really, the big change, that's 10,000 BC or so. So I just want to say that bands are bands and tribes come only later. And then we go on to more stratified societies, chiefdoms, nations, and so on. So when you think about, your ancestors that are in some sense, still in you, you should picture your ancestor in a small band of just like 30 or 40 people. That is the picture. It's the kind of social world to imagine. Don't think tribe like you might think of tribes of different kinds that are bigger, because doing so can actually inhibit getting a proper sympathy or insight into the bandman situation and therefore our bandman instincts.
Would you say that we live in a tribe now? And that we still have the bandman instinct, but we live in a tribe, or do we live in a society that is like downstream from the tribe?
It's downstream from, the modern nation state is a social formation further down on the bullet list. And, it can be totally enormous, as we see today. Now, certain things can be analogized as tribes and spoke of as tribalisms and so forth. And I think that can be very useful. I think the tribal metaphor has its place, but I wouldn't call Americans a tribe. I'd call it a nation, naturally. But the point here is that Hayek's theory, this interpretation of collectivist politics, and really a kind of answer to the big question of, well, if classical liberalism is so great, why aren't more people classical liberal? I mean, in some sense, that's what this political psychology is all about, at least from the Hayekian point of view. Like, why is it that people don't think more like Hayek thinks? That's what all of this is an explanation for. And it's banned. It's not tribe, because people say tribe a lot. They kind of equate the two. And I'm just saying that I think it's important to realize that you shouldn't equate the two, because you really want to get, if you really want to get, the contextualization, the kind of image of the band, the imagination of life in the band, which is very rudimentary, even in terms of language, and developed culture. So I just think that's important. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So to press on into the importance of this distinction and of understanding the band man, what is the difference, and what are the differences maybe between the band man mentality and the mentality we should have in the world we live in?
Right. Yeah, let's get into that. And here, let me begin by mentioning some rather large conceptual headings where I think the differences are very profound. And I won't necessarily elaborate these, but I just want to share them so that I kind of invite people to think how big and deep this matter is. So I've got a bunch of bullet points here. The ethic of the good of the whole. Now, we live in these cultures that pretend to promote the good of the whole, that we're supposed to, it's our responsibility. Well, what is the whole? In the band, it was 40 people. It was quite clear, concrete, known. And the good of that 40 people was fairly straightforward. Today, the whole is all of humankind, including future generations. And what is it that actually constitutes the good of humankind? That's very much open, up for discussion. So there's a tremendous difference there. We would like to have a very concretized, directly cued sense of serving the ethic of, serving ethics, the good of the whole. We would love to have that. We really yearn for that. And the validation that would come from some kind of validation system, which in the band was the band consensus. Okay, so validation is another heading I would list. Another heading I would list is knowledge differences. There's profound differences in knowledge that we could go into. There are profound differences in different sorts of sympathy, where in the band, it was all very immediate. And indeed, the entirety of the whole, all 40 people, often shared sympathy and common experience and encompassing sentiment. But we don't and cannot have that today, even though we most certainly yearn for it. Another heading, social organization. Again, it was very concrete, visible, cooperative, and again, even encompassing cooperation. Don't have that today, can't have that today. And our scale of coordination in an abstract sense is really, really vast, globalized, something that the band man, couldn't even fathom. Another heading, the independence of our understanding in understanding human affairs, human action, on intentions. in the band, intention and action and outcome and results were pretty close together. There's only 40 of us. And if some people were eating and some people were not eating, there's kind of like, hey, leaders, like, why didn't you redistribute the food differently? Right. So there's a lot more like reading of intention from outcomes and so on. The sense of what's voluntary and what's not voluntary, or even the configuration of ownership that stands behind that, I would say, is another heading. The fullness of justice in the band, like you mentioned, we talked about 3 kinds of justices in Adam Smith. And in the band, those were all rather collapsed into one. And it's only in the modern world that we have to see the distinctions and disentangle them and understand how, well, there's this justice lens for the action, and then there's this other justice lens for the action. Whereas in the band, it was like all collapsed into one concentric thing. Feelings of gratefulness and resentfulness, I think we can talk about, and also our modern slogans of inclusion and equity. Inclusion was a very natural thing in the band. Like, everyone around the campfire ate, and you wouldn't have exclusive subgroups so much within the band, right? And you'd be very suspicious towards any such exclusionary activity. And similarly with equity, in terms of how people are faring, what their conditions are. Again, it goes back to very common conditions and even central direction, in the sense of really consensus direction among a small group. So there's very, very profound ways, I feel, that the mentalities, the mentality of bandman and let's say a proper modern outlook operate very profound differences. And we need to kind of see that and cultivate the proper modern outlook. I could turn to some concrete, more intuitive examples, but do you have any questions or comments about any of that?
Yeah, I guess we still have institutions today that kind of support this band mentality. Like the family behaves a lot like the band. And so I guess what are other... The band would still kind of thrive in a sense, even if we acknowledge this. So what role does something like the family play in us being bandman?
Yes, it's things like the family, and the family's very important, most central one, are patterned after the band, are very much so. In fact, the bands, in a sense, are just a few, extended families living together, surviving together. So it's almost the same thing, even. But today, like, we all pursue life outside the family. We all have our family associations, attachments, and then we have our church attachments, our workplace attachments, our school attachments, our friendship circles, our sport club fan circles and interests and everything else, right? And it goes on and on. And people talk about the somewheres and the anywheres, and the anywheres kind of have this whole kind of like, I interact on Twitter kind of attachments and activities and meaning in life. So today there's just no way to like close it for like a definitive we group that coincides with the whole to which ethics speaks. In the band, it was just your band. It wasn't the other band. It wasn't people, on down the river or something. They were strangers at best and enemies at worst. I know there was some trade that may have gone on and stuff, but basically they didn't count ethically. Today, everybody counts, humankind, like I said, even future generations. So we can have a kind of club today where we get together and have experience and sentiment that's shared, and that even encompasses, our little club. Like if we all get together for a football game, or we all go to church, the congregation there has an encompassing sentiment among themselves, but they full well know that as soon as the service is over, they're going to step back into the street and they're going to be among a larger group of society, and their connections are going to cross and intersect in a million different ways. And there's not the same definitive sense of we, right? And so I think we have this strong yearning, not just for shared sentiment, sympathy, but for encompassing, like some kind of definitive we shared sentiment. Durkheim called that effervescence, when the tribe, he was looking at tribes, this is from the elementary forms of religious life, how they come together for kind of rituals, religious rituals in a tribe, and kind of in a inward looking circle, would, have a shared experience that encompass the whole of the group. He very much emphasizes that it's everybody. And this everybodyness to it gave what he called a sort of effervescence to the experience. And so this is just something like we can't do today, but people still yearn for it. And I think they kind of look to government to hope to recreate it. Although I don't think the government succeeds. I think it's a vain and false hope. And I think it's an extremely destructive thing for the government to try to pull off and to use to appeal to voters and sell their agendas. So clubs, if you like, families, clubs today are just, compartmentalized subgroups. It's really not what's so special about the band, where it's like everybody who counted is in that little group. Does that make sense?
Yeah. This kind of brings to mind a lot of people in the political arena today who talk about how we want to elevate the family and kind of, in a way, elevate these institutions that enforce the band, so that instead of the family being the first part of your life or like a connection, one aspect, that is your life in its entirety throughout. I'm kind of butchering the explanation of this, but I'm thinking especially of like Catholics, Nat Con types who think that it's the government's role to essentially elevate the status of the family in one's life. And also, I mean, kind of on the other side, people who are anti-industrialization, who kind of think that fighting against this bandman and modernizing is part of the problem and that we should be in touch with the bandman and stay there. So I guess, how do you respond to those sorts of people?
We are bandman, and there's no getting around that. It's just that we have to work with that and subdue it, rechannel it, and so on. And in terms of finding meaning, ongoing meaning and connection in the modern world, I really think this is a truly great challenge. It's not just, the free market delivers the goods. It doesn't work that way at all. It really, I would say. I mean, it's not a simple, satisfying answer. It's not like toothpaste, human meaning. And I think that people, there's two different ways to take your remarks about people promoting the family. In one way, I'm extremely sympathetic, and I think that family is a really, really, important, promising resource for us to find meaning and continued connection, virtue in the modern world, and that we really should treat it as sacred and try to, preserve and improve and so on and so forth, and take the family really seriously, and have a real certain sentimental attitude toward it. So I actually support that, basically. It's one of the many kind of club-like, endeavors that we need to build in our lives. I think it's what we have to do. Now, people who somehow want to take, like you mentioned, the Catholics. I think Catholics are very much along the lines, the salubrious lines I just spoke of for the most part, but you do have your post-liberal, integralist types. And maybe a way to interpret that is that they're basically, again, like bad band man, what Hayek would call atavists, who want to somehow use their religion with its emphasis on the family to somehow try to create a common shared experience and shared sense of the higher things. Maybe they want to make public life more Catholic and so forth. And so in a way, it's a kind of this collectivism, definitely, I think, that Hayek is diagnosing.
How does this understanding of band man help us understand humans and human institutions like politics?
Why does it, or how does it? I'm sorry.
How? And I guess what else? What am I missing in this
picture? It's kind of like this is an anthropology. Like what is man? What are human beings? And I say, let's start with their band man. They're lactose tolerant band man. It wasn't until shepherding and raising sheep and living off cows and goats and sheep milk that we became lactose tolerant, which comes, whatever, in the last 10 or 20,000 years.
And we're becoming increasingly lactose intolerant. So we're actually reverting more to previous band man.
Yeah.
Very silly.
Yeah. And we can live with that. We can work around that, fortunately. So it's a kind of anthropology. And I think, when you think about what's possible in politics and what's desirable, like what is good for people, where will they find meaning? What can sustain them? I really think that this angle matters a lot. Again, in a sense, our band man, constitution in our genes is what we have to work with. So I don't say, oh, we need to not be band man. It's more like we need to be good. We need to recognize that we're band man to kind of be good man, good human beings, something like that. I know it's a big, hairy thing, but I think there's a lot to this angle in addressing that big question. Okay, if classical liberalism is so great, why is it doing so poorly? Why are so few people actually classical liberals? And I think this is actually a very big part of the answer to that. I don't think it's, like the whole answer by any means. But the way collectivist politics succeed with the median voter, so to speak, I think this has a lot to do with the appeal that collectivist politics has for the median voter. It's like appealing to a lot of these band man mentalities and yearnings, I think. There are a number of intuitive examples I'd like to bring up. Shall I do that?
Yeah.
All right. So suppose I walk into a bar and sitting there is Brian May, the legendary guitarist of Queen. Now, I would most certainly feel a super strong urge to, walk up to him and try to greet him and tell him how much I love Queen. And we have an instinct like that. I think we all know it. And it's like, if I know him, he knows me. And even if I love him, he loves me. That, again, is very natural to the family, which, of course, the band was. In our world, however, Brian May doesn't know me. okay, and doesn't care particularly much about me or any one of his millions and millions of fans. So we have to suppress that urge to greet the celebrity. I'm suggesting that urge is like legacy vestige of our genes, of our bandman genes. This is like an example. Let me give you a couple more. Okay, in the band, there was a very strong sense of common knowledge. We had a shared sense of the way things are. You could call it a shared interpretation of the world. It's not saying that every bit of information was in common. People would go out in the morning and pick berries, and you wouldn't know exactly what they did while they were out there picking berries away from your view. But basically, they returned to the camp, and it was like a common, way of life and rhythm of life. And a common experience, and big things that mattered to us, I think, were quite recognized and felt in common, like privation and dangers, the weather, and so on. So in this world, right, this is, again, imagining band life. And again, this is why it's important to see like Band of 40, not like the Apache tribe or something you might imagine from a movie or something. In this small little world, a personal experience would be very meaningful to everybody who mattered. Like, suppose somebody in the band, encounters a bear while they're out in the forest. That matters to everybody, okay, because our situations are so similar and so common. And, in a group of 40 people, one person is more than 2% of the population. I think that's one reason why anecdotes like cut so much ice with us, carry so much weight with us. In the band, the story of someone's experience would tell us about dangers, if it was a dangerous story, that we might encounter. Now, today, when we hear about someone, say, running into a bear while they're out for a walk, we might blow that way out of proportion because we forget that we hear news, from the media, from millions and millions of people. I mean, the stories of millions and millions of people, very different situations, settings, contexts. And we have learned to some extent to ponder, risks about dangers in ways that, bandman would not be able to fathom at all. So I think like the importance of anecdotes and the weight of anecdotes, or salience, as people sometimes say, is kind of a reflection of our bandman attitudes and our kind of almost instinct for common knowledge. And I also think we have a kind of yearning for this sense of common knowledge. And I think some people promote a kind of pretense of common knowledge, or the hope of achieving a sort of common knowledge, which appeals to people in collectivist politics, when really it's not achievable. In the super large, super complex world we actually live in, our knowledge is super, super disjointed, and it's really bound to be that way. Let me mention one more example, kind of an intuitive thing. Today, we often have, everybody today, it's kind of natural, tends to have an exaggerated view of his own significance, as though, what I do will matter a lot to the good of the whole. Well, in the band, 40 people, my decisions did matter a lot. And if I say, brought home a boar, I slayed a boar and brought it home for dinner, or, I fought off a bear, that did matter a lot to people. What I did matter a lot. People were depending on me. The good of the whole really depended on me. But today, when we think about the whole today, we feel very, very insignificant. And we feel that we don't matter much to the good of the whole. And we don't like to face up maybe to the smallness of our significance to that very vast, ethical concern. And we might even feel cheated somehow by the modern world because we feel so small. So that mentality, too, I think kind of reflects our band past. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I kind of want to talk about now, I guess, like what the band society looked like. You've kind of painted it in two different ways, a little bit egalitarian and a little bit hierarchical. So how is it different from society today, and how is it similar? What did it look like?
Yeah, that's a good point. There is a leadership to it, but it's also very egalitarian. And for that, I would say that that's a very profound. That gives, I think, a very profound difference between, it gets at some of the very profound differences between that state of human existence and our own state of human existence. And let me put it this way: did the band have government? Okay, and my answer to that question is basically no. That you should not think of band leaders as governors in the way that we think of government. The band was like a human troop or organization, and every human organization requires leadership and hierarchy. Those are necessary to function and survive. But I would not say that the leadership necessarily makes it a government. Like, I wouldn't say the leader of a family or the leader of a motorcycle gang, like, is government, okay, over the gang. Government involves, I say, a key distinction based on the distinction of coercion. You know, Weber said that the state was the monopoly of coercion in a territory. And they institutionalize and openly initiate coercion. Governments do. They do things that, if your neighbor tried, would be criminal, would be regarded as criminal. So governments are a very special player that coerce. And so in our world with governments, there's really two kinds of relationships in our world. There's those as between neighbors, okay, like you and your neighbor, and other equals in that jural sense in terms of rights and property and respecting each other's stuff. And then there's the relationship between the governor and the governed, okay? I don't think that second one really existed for the band. I tend to view the band as lacking the second of those two jural relationships. It was just equal. Now, that doesn't mean that, you know, leaders couldn't coerce and sometimes bully people of their band. But that, to me, is like a neighborhood bully or extortionist today, like some robber abusing other people in a neighborhood, other jural equals, if you will. It's not government, is my point. Think about the band situation. There would be limits to how much a leader could bully and abuse. There'd be all sorts of multilateral resistance, the anthropologists teach us, to an abusive leader. Remember, an alpha male is just like another guy with a club, right? It's not like he has a machine gun and a police force. And three of us, even if the alpha male is much stronger than any one of us, could probably take him, right? You know, we're talking about 40 people. And anybody really, I mean, just think at night. It's not like he locks himself into a castle or into, you know, a secure room and goes to sleep. He's like sleeping there, you know, under the tree next to you. And if you want, you could drop a rock on his head. So anybody could kill anybody. It's not government, in my view. And furthermore, members of the band could exit. I mean, there would be no way to prevent people from saying, hey, I'm sick of this. You know, we're going to make our own go our own way as a separate band. They could go their own way. So the band was really like a group of extended families. And the leader, you should think more of as like a father or a leader of a gang and not a government. And so, I just think you should think of it as a world without government. Okay. And so in that sense, it is really very egalitarian. It's kind of a dream world for those who hate government. But I don't think that that's an option anymore today either. I think government's just kind of a reality like gravity and death and inflation myself. And it's something to manage. Yeah.
Well, so I guess in Bandman world, like there's a lot of stuff we talk about today, like liberty, or like virtue and equality even. Mm-hmm. Did this matter to the Bandman? Was this relevant at all?
I think that virtue would have been like very primitive and flat, just kind of like conceptualization would have been. But I think the instinct for equality in a number of respects is very, very strong and natural. I think, that's for sure, kind of solidarity where everybody eats. Not that everyone eats equally necessarily. Some people eat first or best. But I think the equality part is very clear that anthropologists show us about hunter-gatherer societies down, to recorded history and even today. So that's, I think, very clear. The question of liberty, this kind of relates to what I was saying about there being no government. See, I would not say that our ancestors, 10,000 BC, enjoyed liberty. And so let me explain why I think that. I think liberty is a concept 4 times when government exists. So liberty presupposes a government. And in such a world, liberty is greater the less that government messes with people's stuff. That's how I see it. And so you might respond and say, well, if there is no government, then there is no messing by the government. So liberty would seem to be maximal there. But I would call that a category error, that liberty doesn't apply when there is no government. And let me offer this analogy. One might say that good health means freedom from illness and ailment. I think that to say that people in the band enjoyed liberty because they were free from government messing with their stuff is like saying that a stone enjoys good health because it is free from illness and ailment. See, that's a category error. Health is not a concept that applies to stones. Health only applies to entities susceptible to illness and ailment, I would say. And similarly, liberty only applies to societies susceptible to government messing. But the band didn't have government. So I just don't think, I think liberty is like a later concept, okay, for later times with government and hierarchical settled societies.
So I guess let's bring this into the modern world where lots of people, lots of band men, as we still are dissatisfied, depressed, all of that. How does that kind of relate to this transition from the band man to the modern world and then to modern politics? So we feel a lot of disappointment, dissatisfaction with the modern world. I think we're sort of like fish out of water, and we're constantly like trying to rediscover, refine water, living in water, but we can't. And I don't think we should. I think we got to get used to the fact that we're not in water anymore, even though in some sense we're still fish. So that makes us dissatisfied, and it can arouse a lot of resentfulness. And it arouses attempts to get what we yearn for by deluding ourselves into thinking that we can create those things that we yearn for
by governmentalizing social affairs. I mean, you can see just kind of conceptually how, especially say totalitarian politics, it's kind of like trying to recreate that sort of closure and encompassment of the band experience, right? Where there was this compactness and solidarity and unity. And so you can think of all sorts of contrasts here between then and like a liberal modern society. There was unity then, and there's all sorts of division now. There was a sort of commonness to things then versus, I would say, a disjointedness. Again, encompassment versus the compartmentalization that we were talking about, kind of like each family or club having their own little romance and their own little circle, and then many, many, many hundreds and millions of circles that intersect. And more generally, just kind of singularity versus an innumerability, like not just many, but like so many you can't even name them or list them or imagine them all. So, yeah, I think that, how do we deal with this? Let me suggest a comparison between Adam Smith and Rousseau and Marx. Okay. Adam Smith, I think, was really quite aware of this, believe it or not. He spoke of 4 stages of human society, and the first stage sounds amazingly like hunter-gatherer bands. He called it hunter societies, which he said were very small, which he said existed for much, much longer than the 3 succeeding stages, which are shepherding, agriculture, and then commerce. So we got 4 stages: band, hunter-gatherers, hunters, shepherds, agriculture, commerce. And so he kind of sees that we start in hunter and small bands where he says they are very democratic. That goes with that egalitarian. He says that there every man is a statesman and a warrior. And that goes with what I was saying about how every man matters and has to stand up for the good of the whole and do his part and is expected to do his part. So he's got a sense of the whole. There's a sort of importance to that in that, the Ian McGilchrist stuff about the left brain and the right brain, but let's not go into, I can come back to that. But anyway, I think Smith understood this. And when you read his work, you get the feeling that he's saying, don't expect too much from the modern world. Like, I'm not promising to make you happy, with my liberal plan, with the commercial society that I am defending and advocating. Don't expect it to deliver so much. One interesting way to see this is to note how his great works end. The Wealth of Nations ends with telling Great Britain that she should endeavor to accommodate her future views and designs to the real mediocrity of her circumstances. That's pretty dour. And in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, when you remember that it ends with Smith's essay on language, he says something very similar about modern languages, about their prolixness, constraint, and monotony. And he says that this is because modern language has split and divided the operations of language, making everything separated and detached with these little words, which we call prepositions, objects of prepositions, helping verbs, whereas Latin, which was a more organic language community, had all these rich inflections, word ending changes like conjugations of verbs and declensions of nouns and adjectives. And so he's making this point right at the end where he talks about, and we have to get used to the prolixness, constraint, and monotony of modern languages. This is like where we've gotten to, and there's no escaping it. And he's like lamenting this, and he's saying, look, we cannot, with our separated and detached words, actually recreate the organic whole. Okay? He knows that. He's teaching us that in his works, actually. Whereas Marx and Rousseau, they're very much like, I would say, pandering to the yearning of band man. Rousseau's complaints were extremely influential and moved people and sort of touched people, but they amounted to nothing in terms of actual practical advice and direction. Really, absolutely nothing but foolishness. And I would say that Marx's alienation stuff, about things being separated and detached, that's kind of like you're separated from the product of your work, you're separated from other members of the economy and the community. The division of labor is sort of like the division of the soul in Marx. So he too is playing upon this, deep penchant, bent mentality, instinct, and dissatisfaction, and it's wreaking havoc. I mean, I think both guys were wrong in really fundamental ways, and in a way were very selfish and irresponsible. So again, I really think that all this stuff helps us to understand why these bad political ideas and bad political thinkers like Rousseau and Marx get so much love and praise and support.
I guess knowing that, what do we do from here? What is there to be done with this information? Yeah,
it's a kind of a delicate matter. I mean, I think that people need to hear this. That is to say, people need to get exposed to the idea that our politics has gone wayward, gone awry, I guess you could say. And I think Hayek is quite right that when the nation state really became the vogue, which I guess you could say was really the 19th century in the West. Britain got there early and was kind of a model for the concept, and the United States was an offshoot of that and had a very special, experience and creation. And then the French Revolution is very important in this story, and then the whole idea of forming nation states. And then the idea of the democratic nation state, trying to create that democratic element that's in the band, the very strong consensus, solidarity. And so politics at the end, especially in the later part of the 19th century, very much shifted to this kind of collectivist penchant bent mentality. And we've really been stuck there ever since, I would say. That's when classical liberalism really collapsed. It's when the Liberal Party in Britain changed its character. It's when socialism became very fashionable. And, we quickly moved into the horrors of the early 20th century on just these grounds. I mean, what was Nazism? What was Stalinism? What was fascism? It was just this. It was, fascism. It's like, let's bind us all together through the state. So people need to see that this didn't come out of nowhere. This came out of, what's in our genes. And I think, we need to, just like Hayek tried and to some extent succeeded, clue people in about this and get them to rethink, get them to be more hesitant about their strong political penchants, that are interventionist or collectivist, because, hey, maybe you're, letting your bandman, you're indulging something irresponsibly. So if we can suggest this to a wide range of people, to the public at large, it might help to, get people to fall back on their heels a little bit, push people back on their heels a little bit, get them to reflect, get them to reconsider, and get them to realize that, hey, so listen, we're not in the band anymore. So what sort of institutional arrangements, public policies actually suit where we find ourselves today? And again, I would point them to Hayek and Adam Smith and all that good stuff. So it's all part of this process of saying, this is why we disagree so fundamentally in politics. We're working from very deep, different political psychologies. I mean, we all start the same as bandman, but some of us have been more open somehow to I would say, somehow adjusting, subduing, rechanneling what we're working with than others.
Thank you for that. And thank you for taking the time to talk to me. I've learned so much, so thank you. I have one last question for you, which is, what is one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
I once gave a lecture called 10 Good Reasons Not to Vote. And I would not give that lecture today. I am now, more positive towards voting. I'm not urging people to go and vote or something. So why have I changed my attitude about voting? And I can say this. I feel that moral rootedness is a matter of playing one's part in larger matters, including politics, and that politics is a matter of lesser evil. It's always about the lesser evil, because the greater evil can be much greater in evil. And in voting, by actually voting, I humble myself to the smallness of my part in the world and personally ratify my own judgment as to what is the lesser evil out there.
Once again, I'd like to thank my guest for their time and insight, and I'd like to thank you for listening to the Great Antidote podcast. The Great Antidote is sound engineered by Rich Goyette. If you have any questions, any guests or topic recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@gmail.com. Thank you.